What's the worst affair at school you've seen? Principal Rollins and Mrs. Haney, my former second-grade teacher, were kissing. Not a friendly peck, but real kissing, like in movies. My 8-year-old brain felt scrambled because both of them had families who came to school events all the time. Being a typical third grader with no filter, I immediately told everyone at my lunch table. The news spread through the cafeteria like spilled juice. By the time recess ended, kids from every grade were whispering about what I'd seen. Someone must have told a teacher because I got called to the principal's office during last period. When I walked in, Mrs. Haney was already there looking furious. Principal Rollins locked the door behind me, which made my hands start sweating. They didn't even pretend to be nice. He started yelling that I was a liar and troublemaker. Mrs. Haney called me manipulative and said I just wanted attention. They took turns telling me how disappointed my parents would be. They made me write an apology letter right there, admitting I'd made everything up. Principal Rollins stood over my shoulder while I wrote that I was sorry for lying. My hand was shaking so bad the words came out all crooked. Some kids believed I was a liar, while others whispered they'd seen the principal and Mrs. Haney acting weird before. I spent most of recess alone reading in the corner trying to be invisible. Even my favorite teacher seemed disappointed in me. About a month later, I stayed after school because my mom was running late picking me up. The building was mostly empty, and I was reading in the library when I realized I'd left my homework folder in my classroom. I walked down the quiet hallway hoping the room would still be unlocked so I could grab it. As I got closer to my classroom, I heard voices coming from Principal Rollins's office. His door was slightly open and the light was on. I don't know why, but something made me creep closer and peek through the crack. What I saw made my whole body freeze like I'd touched an electric fence. Principal Rollins was in there with someone, but it wasn't Mrs. Haney this time. He was kissing another woman whose back was to the door. She had long brown hair just like Mrs. Haney, but something about her seemed familiar. Then she turned slightly, and I saw her profile. My stomach dropped to my shoes. It was my mom. My own mother was kissing Principal Rollins in his office while she was supposed to be picking me up. Her purse that I'd helped her pick out for her birthday was sitting on his desk. They were holding hands, and he was playing with her wedding ring, the same ring my dad had given her that she never took off. I must have made a noise because they both looked toward the door. My mom's face went white when she saw me. She called my name, but I was already running. I ran down the hallway and out the front doors and kept running until I couldn't breathe. I hid behind the dumpsters in the parking lot trying not to throw up. My mom found me 10 minutes later. She was crying and trying to explain, but I couldn't hear her over the buzzing in my ears. She kept saying it wasn't what it looked like, even though we both knew that was a lie. She begged me not to tell Dad and promised she would end things with Principal Rollins immediately. The car ride home was silent, except for her sniffling. When we got home, she acted normal in front of my dad and little sister. I went straight to my room and pretended to do homework while my brain tried to process what I'd seen. At dinner, I could barely look at either of my parents. That night, I heard my mom on the phone in her bathroom whispering urgently to someone. The last week of school, I was cleaning out my desk when Mrs. Haney asked me to stay after class. She sat on her desk and looked at me with this strange expression. Then she said something that made all the puzzle pieces click into place in the worst way. You know, your mom and I used to be best friends before she started stealing everyone's husbands. Don't think Principal Rollins is the first. My feet wouldn't move, even though the dismissal bell was ringing and kids were rushing past the classroom door. Mrs. Haney just sat there on her desk, watching me with this sad smile, while my brain tried to make sense of what she'd said about Mom. The floor tiles blurred as tears started coming, and I wiped them away fast because crying in front of her felt wrong somehow. She hopped off the desk and walked over to pat my shoulder, but I jerked away and ran out into the hallway. Kids were everywhere grabbing backpacks and heading for buses, but I pushed through them toward the side exit nobody used. My legs carried me down streets I'd never walked before, past houses with neat yards and dogs barking behind fences. The backpack straps dug into my shoulders, and each step felt harder than the last, but I couldn't go straight home yet. I took the long way through the park where the swings were empty and the sandbox looked abandoned in the afternoon sun. By the time I reached our driveway, my shirt was soaked with sweat and my mouth tasted like pennies. Mom's car was already there, which meant she'd gotten home early from wherever she really went during the day. I stood at the front door for a whole minute before turning the knob and stepping inside, where everything looked normal but felt completely different. The smell of pot roast hit me, and I heard Mom humming in the kitchen like nothing had happened at all. My little sister was coloring at the coffee table, and Dad's briefcase sat by the door, which meant he was home early too. At dinner, I pushed food around my plate while Dad talked about some project at work, and Mom kept asking if I felt okay. My stomach churned watching them pass the salt and butter the rolls, like we were some perfect family from a TV show. Dad asked about my day, and the words stuck in my throat, so I just mumbled something about math being hard. Mom reached over to feel my forehead, and I pulled back so fast I knocked over my milk glass. While we cleaned up the spill, Dad made jokes about growth spurts and clumsiness, but I couldn't even fake a smile. After dinner, I went straight to my room and lay on the bed staring at baseball cards without really seeing them. Through the wall, I heard Mom's voice get sharp and angry as she talked on her bedroom phone. The words weren't clear, but I caught pieces like, "had no right to say that," and "bitter witch," and I knew she meant Mrs. Haney. Her voice got louder, then quieter, then louder again, and I pressed my pillow over my ears, but couldn't block it out completely. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of pancakes and bacon, which only happened on birthdays or special occasions. Mom was already dressed with makeup on, and her biggest smile as she flipped pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse. She asked if I wanted to skip school and go to the zoo, or maybe that arcade I liked downtown. The guilt was so obvious it made my stomach hurt, but I told her I had a spelling test I couldn't miss. Her face fell for a second before the fake smile came back, and she packed my lunch with extra cookies and a juice box. At the school, I took the long way to class to avoid walking past the principal's office where everything had started. During library time, I hid behind the tall shelves pretending to look for books, while really just trying to be invisible. Mrs. Haney passed me in the hallway after lunch and gave me this look that made me want to sink into the floor. She didn't say anything, but her eyes were sad and sorry at the same time, and I practically ran to the bathroom. The rest of the school year crawled by with me eating lunch alone and reading during recess instead of playing kickball. When summer finally came, I spent every day at the library, reading every book in the kids section, or riding my bike in circles around the neighborhood. Mom kept suggesting trips to the pool or the movies, but I always had homework to finish, or my stomach hurt, or I'd promised to help Dad in the garage. She tried signing me up for soccer camp, but I refused to get out of the car when she drove me there the first day. One afternoon, while reading comics in my room, I heard Mom talking to Dad in the kitchen about how worried she was about me. She said maybe I needed to talk to someone professional, since I'd gotten so quiet and wouldn't spend time with her anymore. The irony of her concern made me want to scream, but I just turned the comic page louder, so they'd know I was there. Dad said kids go through phases, and I'd probably snap out of it once school started again, but Mom kept insisting something was really wrong. 4th grade started with a new principal named Mr. Peterson, who smiled too much and high-fived kids in the hallway. Everyone whispered about why Principal Rollins had left so suddenly over the summer without even a goodbye assembly. Some kids said he got a better job in another state, but others heard their parents talking about complaints and investigations. I kept my mouth shut and focused on my worksheets whenever anyone brought it up during lunch or recess. The new principal didn't know about my lying incident, so teachers stopped giving me those disappointed looks all the time. Mom signed up to help with the fall festival, but when she showed up, other moms moved to different craft tables or suddenly remembered errands they had to run. She kept her volunteer smile on, but I saw it crack when Mrs. Turner whispered something to Mrs. Garcia, and they both looked at her. During the bake sale, she stood alone at her table, while groups of parents clustered at other tables talking in low voices. I watched from the playground as she pretended to arrange brownies that were already perfectly arranged and checked her phone over and over. Her fake smile never left, but her hands shook a little as she poured lemonade for the few kids who came to her table. 5th grade started with me sitting in the back row of every class and teachers writing "mature but withdrawn" on my report cards. I'd learned to keep my head down and do my work without making waves or friends. The school counselor pulled me aside once to ask if everything was okay at home, and I just nodded and said everything was fine. She gave me this look like she didn't believe me but didn't push it. At parent-teacher conferences, my new teacher told Mom and Dad I was doing well academically, but seemed isolated from my peers. Mom's face got tight, and she said I'd always been more of a reader than a social butterfly. Dad just looked confused and asked if maybe I needed to join more activities. I shrugged and stared at the bulletin board behind them, covered in student artwork I hadn't contributed to. The year crawled by with me eating lunch alone and spending recess in the library corner with whatever book I could find. Other kids had started forming their little groups, and I wasn't part of any of them. Middle school came as a relief because suddenly being invisible was easier with hundreds of kids, instead of just 60. Nobody knew about the principal thing or Mom's volunteer disasters from elementary school. I could walk the hallways without anyone whispering or giving me weird looks. My English teacher assigned a personal essay about a meaningful experience, and everyone else wrote about vacations or pets dying. I stared at the blank page for an hour before writing 3 pages about watching butterflies in my backyard. She gave me an A and wrote "beautiful imagery" in red pen, but I knew she could tell I was hiding something real. 8th grade brought a new kind of tension when Mom and Dad sat us down at dinner one night. Dad's hands were folded on the table, and Mom kept touching her wedding ring. They said they'd decided to try marriage counseling to work on their communication. My little sister asked if they were getting divorced, and Mom quickly said no, while Dad just stared at his plate. I watched them leave together every Thursday evening and come back looking tired and not talking to each other. High school meant even more ways to stay busy and away from home. I signed up for drama club the first week and threw myself into learning lines and building sets. Being on stage felt safer than being myself because I could pretend to be someone without secrets. The drama teacher said I had natural talent, but I think she just recognized someone else who preferred fiction to reality. I stayed after school for rehearsals until the janitor kicked us out and volunteered for every production, even the ones I wasn't cast in. Weekends were tech rehearsals and line runs and anything to avoid family dinners where we all pretended everything was normal. Senior year, the acceptance letter came from a college 3 states away, and I felt my chest loosen for the first time in years. Mom cried at the kitchen table saying she couldn't believe her baby was going so far away. Dad said he was proud, but looked sad in a way that had nothing to do with me leaving. I packed my room methodically and counted down the days until I could start over where nobody knew anything about 3rd grade. 20 years went by in what felt like both forever and an instant. I went through 3 therapists who never quite understood why I couldn't maintain relationships. Dating felt impossible when you couldn't trust anyone, and friendships faded when you kept people at arm's length. I worked remote jobs and moved apartments every few years and told myself I was fine. Then one random Tuesday, I was scrolling social media during lunch and saw a post from my hometown newspaper. Principal Rollins was receiving some community service award for his volunteer work in retirement. The article called him a pillar of the community and showed him smiling with his wife at some charity event. My hands started shaking so bad, I dropped my phone and had to leave work early. That night, I couldn't sleep and finally Googled therapists in my area at 3 in the morning. Ariel Stevenson's website said she specialized in childhood trauma, and something about her face looked kind. I called her office the next morning and told the receptionist I needed the first available appointment. When I walked into her office 3 days later, she had plants everywhere and soft lighting that made me feel less exposed. She asked what brought me in, and I said I needed help processing something from 3rd grade. She didn't laugh or look surprised, just nodded and asked me to start wherever felt comfortable. Over the next few sessions, we built a timeline on her whiteboard with different colored markers for each year. Seeing it all laid out made me realize I'd been carrying this completely alone for over 20 years. She suggested reaching out to the school district to see if any records existed from that time. She said sometimes having documentation helped with processing and validation. I emailed Albert Sloan at the district office that night, explaining I needed my elementary records for therapy purposes. He called me the next day with this professional but curious voice, asking about records from so long ago. I told him it was related to some incidents in 3rd and 4th grade that were affecting my mental health. He said he'd check their archive systems, but warned that older records were often purged or incomplete. While waiting for his response, I found myself driving past my old elementary school one afternoon, without really planning it. The building looked so much smaller than I remembered, but my hands still shook as I turned into the visitor lot. I sat in my car staring at the front doors where I'd run out crying all those years ago. The car door handle felt cold under my hand as I finally pushed myself to get out and walk around the building. My feet carried me along the same path I used to take to the playground every day at recess. Near the swings, a woman with short gray hair was checking something on a clipboard, and she looked up when she heard my footsteps on the gravel. She squinted at me for a second before her face changed like she recognized something. "I know you," she said, walking closer. "You were in 3rd grade when I was a junior counselor here." Her name tag said Kendra Beck, and suddenly I remembered her from the library, always organizing reading groups and helping kids with homework. I told her I was just visiting and trying to remember some things from back then. Her expression got careful when I mentioned 3rd grade. "That was an interesting year," she said slowly. "Principal Rollins left so suddenly that summer. There were questions nobody asked out loud." She looked at the building like she was seeing ghosts too. Some of us younger staff noticed things, but we learned quick not to say anything. She gave me her business card and said to call if I ever wanted to talk more about those days. Back in my car, my phone buzzed with an email from Albert Sloan. The attachment loaded slowly, and then there it was on my screen. My apology letter from 3rd grade. The handwriting was mine, but shaky and uneven. The words forced out under pressure. "I am sorry for telling lies about Principal Rollins and Mrs. Haney. I made it all up for attention. I promise never to spread false rumors again." Reading it made my stomach turn the same way it did when I wrote it. The sophisticated language no 8-year-old would use on their own jumped out at me now. Words like false rumors and seeking attention that Principal Rollins had dictated while standing over my shoulder. I saved the file to 3 different places on my computer, finally having proof that the whole thing really happened. That weekend, I went to my parents' house for dinner and found Dad alone in the garage working on his car. I handed him a wrench and mentioned I'd been thinking about elementary school lately, especially 3rd grade. He wiped his hands on a rag and said those were simpler times before everything got so complicated. "You were such a happy kid back then," he said, completely missing what I was really asking. "Always reading and telling stories." I wanted to push harder, but his face looked so tired that I just nodded and changed the subject to the car engine. That night I sat at my computer for an hour, before finally typing an email to Mrs. Haney through the district's retirement contact system. My fingers shook as I wrote that I was the student from her 2nd grade class who'd caused trouble in 3rd grade and that I'd like to talk if she was willing. I hit send before I could lose my nerve. 3 hours later, my phone pinged with her reply. "I remember you well. Coffee next Tuesday at 10 a.m. The Sunrise Cafe on Oak Street. Just seeing her name in my inbox made my hands sweat. The next morning I called Colton Rowe, who I'd stayed in touch with through social media over the years. He picked up on the second ring, and we chatted about work and life for a few minutes before I brought up third grade. "Do you remember when I told everyone about Principal Rollins and Mrs. Haney?" I asked. He laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "How could I forget? You told us at lunch, and by last period the whole school knew. Then you had to apologize, and all the teachers acted so weird after that." He paused. "My mom always said something fishy happened that year. She tried to get other parents to ask questions, but nobody wanted to rock the boat. We talked for another 20 minutes, and he promised to send me some old class photos he'd scanned. Monday afternoon I had my regular session with Ariel, and we spent the whole hour preparing for my upcoming conversation with Mom. She had me sit in different chairs to practice different scenarios. First, we worked on what to do if Mom denied everything. Then we practiced staying calm if she tried to blame me for bringing it up. We went through deflection tactics and guilt trips, and every manipulation technique Ariel had seen in 20 years of practice. "Remember, you're not responsible for her emotions," Ariel kept saying. "You're allowed to ask for truth." By the end, I felt steadier, like I had armor made of words and boundaries. Tuesday, I met Mom for lunch at a restaurant downtown. She looked happy to see me until I brought up Principal Rollins directly. Her face went white, and she set down her fork. "Why are you bringing up ancient history?" she asked. I told her I'd been in therapy working through some childhood stuff. She picked up her water glass, and her hand was shaking. "Marriages go through complicated phases," she said quickly. "Your father and I worked through our issues long ago." Then she started talking about her friend's new grandchild and wouldn't let me get another word in about Principal Rollins. She paid the check and practically ran to her car. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text from Mom. "I'm sorry for whatever you think happened when you were young. I hope you can move past old misunderstandings and focus on the present. We all did our best with what we knew at the time." Classic non-apology wrapped in guilt and deflection. I screenshot it and sent it to Ariel without commenting. Wednesday morning, Albert called while I was making coffee. "I've been digging through our auxiliary systems," he said. "Most detailed records from that era were purged according to retention policies, but I'll keep looking." His tone suggested he suspected there was more to this story than a kid needing old report cards. "Between you and me, I've seen similar requests when people are building cases or seeking validation for past events. Whatever you're looking for, I hope you find it." He promised to call if anything else turned up in the archives. Thursday, I met Kendra for coffee at a place near the school. She stirred her latte for a long time before speaking. "I was 22 and so eager to help kids," she started. "I noticed Principal Rollins had a lot of closed-door meetings with certain female staff members. The doors were always locked and the blinds drawn." She looked out the window. Once I mentioned to my supervisor that it seemed unusual. She told me to focus on my own responsibilities, unless I wanted to find myself looking for a new job. She said, after Principal Rollins left that summer, everyone pretended like he'd never existed. New principal came in, and nobody ever mentioned why the position had opened up so suddenly. Friday afternoon, I sat in Ariel's office describing that day behind the dumpsters, and suddenly the smell hit me all over again. Rotting food and wet cardboard filled my nose, even though I was sitting on her clean couch 20 years later. My hands remembered the sharp gravel digging into my palms when I'd crouched there trying not to puke. Ariel noticed me gripping the armrest and guided me through breathing exercises until the room stopped spinning. She counted slowly, while I matched my breaths to her voice, and gradually, the garbage smell faded back into memory. That weekend, I couldn't stop thinking about everything and started Googling Principal Rollins out of curiosity. The third result made me want to throw my laptop across the room. There he was getting some community leadership award just last month with a big smile and a plaque. The article praised his dedication to education and mentoring young people, which made bile rise in my throat. I screenshot the article and texted it to Ariel asking if maybe now was the time to go public with everything. She called me right away and spent 20 minutes reminding me that my healing came first and revenge wouldn't fix what happened. Sunday night, I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, trying to figure out what telling Dad would actually mean. On one side, I wrote all the reasons to tell him, including that he deserved the truth and keeping secrets was eating me alive. On the other side, I listed how it would destroy him and probably end their marriage and hurt my sister, who still didn't know. The page filled up with arrows connecting different points, and by midnight, I had 3 pages of pros and cons that didn't make the decision any clearer. Monday, I met Mrs. Haney at this quiet cafe downtown where nobody from the school would see us. She looked older with gray streaking through her hair, but her eyes were still sharp as ever. After we ordered coffee, she looked straight at me and told me something that changed everything I thought I knew. She said she and Mom had been best friends since college, until she came home early one day and found Mom in bed with her husband. This was years before the Principal Rollins thing even started. She explained how she'd divorced quietly without making a scene because she had 2 young kids to think about. Staying in the same town meant watching Mom play perfect wife at the school events while knowing what she really was. When she saw Mom with Principal Rollins, it hurt, but didn't surprise her one bit because that was just Mom's pattern. Tuesday, I went to the library and pulled out yearbooks from my elementary years. Page after page showed what I'd been too young to notice back then. There was Mom and Principal Rollins at the science fair standing closer than normal. At the spring carnival, they were always in the same frame, even when their families weren't. The fall festival photos showed them laughing together while Dad stood off to the side looking at his phone. Every single school event had them positioned near each other, and now that I knew what to look for, the evidence was obvious. Wednesday's therapy session hit different after everything I'd learned that week. Ariel helped me understand something that made me cry harder than I had in years. 8-year-old me wasn't responsible for protecting Dad from the truth, or keeping Mom's secrets or any of it. She kept repeating that children aren't supposed to carry adult problems, and the weight I'd been hauling around for 20 years was never mine to carry. The relief and grief hit at the same time, and I sobbed into the throw pillow, while she sat quietly, letting me feel it all. Thursday morning, Albert called saying he'd found something in the archived files. There was this vague administrative note about addressing a student behavioral issue regarding false statements, dated right after I'd been forced to apologize. The bureaucratic language was clearly designed to hide what really happened, but seeing it written down as some behavioral issue made me so mad my hands shook. Albert said he'd keep copies in case I ever needed them for anything. Friday, I met Kendra again, and she admitted something that had been bothering her for years. Back then, she'd tried reporting her concerns about Principal Rollins to the district office. They told her she was too junior to understand complex administrative dynamics, and suggested she focus on her own students. She still felt guilty about not pushing harder when she knew something was wrong, but she'd been scared of losing her job. She said watching me get punished for telling the truth while the adults got protected still haunted her sometimes. Saturday, I finally confronted Mom about what Mrs. Haney had told me. We met at her house while Dad was golfing, and I laid it all out about her pattern of going after other women's husbands. Her face went through about 10 different expressions before she landed on defensive anger. She immediately started blaming Dad, saying he was emotionally absent and never paid attention to her. She said I couldn't understand what it was like being married to someone who treated you like furniture. Then she tried turning it around, saying Mrs. Haney was bitter and jealous and had always been dramatic about everything. Sunday night, I couldn't sleep thinking about everything Mom had said, so I went downstairs for water and found Dad sitting alone at the kitchen table staring at old photo albums. He looked up when I walked in and patted the chair next to him, so I sat down, even though it was past midnight. The photos were from when I was in 3rd grade, and there we all were at the school carnival looking like a normal, happy family. Dad ran his finger over one picture and told me he'd sensed something was off back then, but didn't want to believe it. His voice cracked when he said he should have paid more attention instead of working so much. Watching him sit there with tears rolling down his face was harder than if he'd been yelling or throwing things, because this quiet sadness felt like watching him break apart piece by piece. Monday, I met Colton for lunch at this sandwich place near his office, and we talked about old times until he mentioned something that made me put down my sandwich. His mom had complained to the school board about Principal Rollins being inappropriate with female staff members back when we were in 4th grade. She'd written this whole formal complaint with dates and witnesses, but nothing ever happened except she got labeled a troublemaker, and they moved her to a different school the next year. Colton said his mom still gets mad about it sometimes because she knew something bad was happening, but nobody would listen. Tuesday morning, I pulled out that old apology letter Albert had sent me copies of, and really looked at it with adult eyes this time. The words were way too fancy for any 3rd grader, with phrases like irresponsible allegations and damaging the reputation of respected educators that no 8-year-old would ever use. My handwriting was shaky and uneven, but the words themselves were clearly dictated by someone else, probably Principal Rollins, standing over me telling me exactly what to write. Reading it now made me feel sick to my stomach because the coercion was so obvious that any adult should have seen a scared kid being forced to lie. Wednesday's therapy session started with Ariel having me write a letter to my 8-year-old self, which felt weird at first, but then the words started pouring out. I wrote about how brave he was for telling the truth, even when the adults punished him for it, and how none of what happened was his fault. I told him the adults were wrong to make him carry their secrets, and that he deserved protection, not punishment. Ariel had me read it out loud, and I couldn't get through the first paragraph without crying, so hard I could barely breathe. She sat there quietly handing me tissues while I sobbed through every single word, telling that little kid all the things nobody had said to him back then. Thursday, I called Mrs. Haney to ask about her timeline, and she revealed her divorce happened right after that school year ended, which wasn't a coincidence. She wouldn't give me all the details, but said Principal Rollins had a pattern of targeting women when they were going through rough patches in their marriages. She mentioned at least 3 other teachers who suddenly transferred or quit during his time as principal, and how there were always whispers, but never proof. The way she talked made it clear he was careful about picking women who had something to lose if they spoke up. Friday morning, Albert called to explain that the statute of limitations had passed years ago for any criminal charges or civil lawsuits related to what happened. He said even if we had concrete proof of the coercion and threats, there was nothing legally we could do about it now. but he offered to add my statement to an archival file that would at least document what really happened, even if it couldn't lead to any consequences. It wasn't justice, but having some official record felt better than nothing at all. Over the weekend, I sat at my computer drafting an impact statement, describing everything that happened from finding them kissing to being forced to write that apology letter to carrying the secret about Mom. Each sentence felt like pulling out a splinter that had been stuck under my skin for 20 years, festering and hurting. I wrote about the nightmares and the trust issues, and how I still flinch when authority figures raise their voices. The statement ended up being 12 pages long, and reading it back made me realize just how much damage those adults had done to one small kid. Monday, Kendra agreed to meet me at the district office where she co-signed a supporting statement about the institutional culture that enabled Principal Rollins to operate without oversight. She wrote about being told to mind her own business and how junior staff were discouraged from reporting concerns about senior administrators. Having someone who was actually there willing to back up my story felt like validation I didn't know I needed. We submitted both statements together, and Albert made official copies for the permanent archive. Tuesday night, I wrote a letter to Principal Rollins detailing exactly what he did to me as a child and how it affected my entire life. I didn't hold back describing the coercion and threats and the way he used his power to silence an 8-year-old who told the truth. I mailed it to his house knowing he'd probably show it to a lawyer immediately. His response came back within a week, and it was exactly what I expected, just lawyer language saying he had no recollection of the alleged events and categorically denied any wrongdoing. Reading his non-admission made my anger crystallize into something cold and sharp that scared me with its intensity. Wednesday, I spent the whole day fantasizing about showing up at his country club or posting everything on social media with his photo so everyone would know what he really was. I imagined the look on his face if I confronted him in front of his golf buddies or his church friends. The fantasies got more elaborate with me hiring a plane to fly a banner over his house or putting up billboards with his picture and the word predator in huge letters. Thursday's session with Ariel was just me raging about the unfairness while she helped me sit with the feelings without acting on any of my revenge fantasies. Friday morning, Ariel had me write out exactly what I wanted to say to Mom about boundaries, and we practiced it over and over until the words stopped making me shake. I sat in her office chair while she pretended to be Mom, trying every trick to make me back down. She interrupted me and cried fake tears and blamed Dad for being cold, and I kept repeating the same sentence about how her choices hurt me. We went through it maybe 20 times until I could say it without my voice cracking or getting pulled into defending myself. Saturday, I kept practicing in my bathroom mirror, watching my face stay calm while saying the words out loud. Sunday dinner with my parents and sister felt like walking into a test I'd studied for, but still might fail. We were eating pot roast when I set down my fork and told them I'd been forced to lie about something real in 3rd grade. Dad stopped chewing and Mom's face went pale, but my sister just stared at her plate like she already knew what was coming. I explained how Principal Rollins and Mrs. Haney made me write that apology letter and threatened to expel me if I didn't take back what I saw. Mom started to say something, but Dad held up his hand to let me finish. My sister's knuckles were white around her fork, and when I caught her eye, she gave me this tiny nod like she was saying, "Keep going." After dinner, my sister followed me out to the back porch, where we used to hide during Mom and Dad's fights when we were kids. She lit a cigarette with shaking hands and told me Mom had been lying to her for years about different things. There was money missing from her college fund that Mom said Dad spent, but she found receipts proving Mom took it. There were times Mom said she was at book club, but my sister saw her car at weird places around town. She told me about finding Mom's second phone hidden in the garage and how Mom made up this whole story about needing it for work, even though she'd been retired for 2 years. We sat there comparing notes until it got dark and realized the lies went back way further than either of us wanted to admit. Monday, I called Dad at work and asked if we could talk alone after he got home. He said sure, but his voice sounded tired like he already knew something heavy was coming. I spent the whole day writing down what I wanted to say and tearing it up and starting over because nothing seemed right. When he got home, we went out to his workshop, where he keeps all his woodworking tools and the half-finished bookshelf he's been building for 3 years. I sat on his workbench while he organized screws that didn't need organizing, and I told him everything about Mom and Principal Rollins. He kept sorting screws into little containers and didn't look at me for the longest time. Then he set down the container and said real quiet that he'd suspected something back then, but hoped he was wrong. His hands were shaking when he said he'd noticed things, but convinced himself he was being paranoid. That night, I heard them in their bedroom, and for the first time in my whole life, I heard real shouting, not just the quiet arguing they usually did. Dad's voice was loud and angry in a way I'd never heard before, and Mom was crying and yelling back. Around midnight, I heard Dad's footsteps go past my door toward the guest room, and then the door shut hard. The next morning, he was already gone when I woke up, but there was a note on the kitchen counter saying he'd told Mom they needed professional help immediately, or he was done. Tuesday afternoon, my phone buzzed with an email from Mom that was 3 pages long, admitting she'd had an affair with Principal Rollins, but spending most of it complaining about how Dad was emotionally unavailable and never appreciated her, and how she had needs that weren't being met. She wrote about feeling invisible and undesired, and how Principal Rollins made her feel young again. I read it once, then forwarded it straight to Ariel without reading it again, because I knew it would just make me angry. Wednesday, Albert called to confirm that my statement and Kendra's were officially in the permanent archive now. He said it wasn't much, but at least there was an official record somewhere that documented what really happened. It felt like a tiny win, but still a win, knowing the truth was written down in a place where it couldn't be destroyed or denied. Thursday, I got a text from Mrs. Haney thanking me for reaching out and saying our conversation had helped her process some old wounds too. She wasn't ready to go public or take any action, but she appreciated that someone else finally knew the real story and believed her. Friday afternoon, Albert sent me a screenshot showing that Principal Rollins had been quietly removed from the district's distinguished alumni list on their website. There was no announcement or explanation, but his name and photo were gone like he'd never existed. Albert had raised concerns with the board using our statements, and even though they couldn't do anything official, they'd decided having him on the list wasn't appropriate anymore. I spent the whole weekend staring at my laptop with the draft email to the local news sitting there unsent. My finger hovered over the send button about 50 times, but something kept stopping me. Dad was already sleeping in the guest room, and my sister was barely talking to Mom, and adding public humiliation to the mix felt like throwing gasoline on a fire that was already burning down our house. Monday morning, I deleted the draft and texted Ariel that I needed help figuring out boundaries instead of revenge. She had me come in that afternoon with a notebook, and we spent 2 hours mapping out exactly what I could and couldn't handle with Mom going forward. We wrote it all down in bullet points like limited phone calls once a month, no visits without Dad present, and absolutely no unsupervised time if I ever had kids. Ariel helped me practice saying the words out loud until they stopped making my voice shake. That night, Dad texted me a picture from a therapist's waiting room with just a thumbs-up emoji. The next morning, he called and said the session went better than expected, and his therapist specialized in exactly this kind of betrayal trauma. He sounded lighter somehow, like admitting he needed help had taken weight off his shoulders. Thursday, I drove to my old elementary school after hours and parked in the same spot where Mom had found me behind the dumpsters all those years ago. The dumpsters were still there, rusty and dented in different places now. I walked over and sat on the ground in the exact spot where 8-year-old me had hidden, trying not to throw up while my world fell apart. This time I wasn't hiding, though. I pulled out my phone and recorded a voice memo telling that scared kid that he made it through, that he grew up and learned how to tell the truth, even when powerful people tried to silence him. Friday, Kendra and I started meeting for coffee every month at this little place downtown where nobody from the school district ever went. She told me about the new policies she was pushing through now that she had more authority, things like mandatory reporting training that actually meant something and protection for staff who raised concerns. She showed me drafts of new protocols that would make it harder for people like Principal Rollins to operate without oversight. We talked about how institutions protect themselves first and kids last, and how she was working to flip that priority from the inside. 2 weeks later, I asked Mom to meet me at a restaurant, not our usual place, but somewhere public, where she couldn't make a scene. I brought the boundary letter Ariel and I had worked on, typed up and printed on regular paper. Mom showed up 20 minutes late wearing sunglasses, even though it was cloudy, and I could tell she'd been crying in her car. I read the letter out loud while she picked at her napkin and made these little gasping sounds. She kept reaching across the table trying to grab my hands, but I kept them in my lap holding the paper steady. When I got to the part about supervised visits with future grandchildren, she actually sobbed out loud, and people at other tables turned to look. She begged me to reconsider, said she'd do anything to fix this, promised she'd changed, but I just kept reading until I got to the end. Then I folded the letter, put it in my pocket, and left cash for my coffee before walking out while she was still crying into her hands. The next week, Colton called me out of nowhere saying he'd been thinking about elementary school lately and remembered that whole thing with me and the supposed rumor. He said a bunch of kids from our class had been talking on social media about weird stuff from back then, and my name came up. He wanted to know if I was okay and if the rumor was actually true. I thanked him for reaching out and for believing something was off back then, but told him I wasn't ready to discuss it with anyone else from the school. He understood and said if I ever wanted to talk, he'd listen. 6 months passed with me following the boundaries exactly as written. Mom sent long emails I didn't read and left voicemails I deleted without listening. Dad got stronger in therapy and even started going to a support group for betrayed spouses. My sister and I grew closer through all of it, checking in on each other and comparing notes about our different experiences with Mom's lies. My sleep got better gradually, going from 2 or 3 hours of tossing and turning to actually sleeping through most nights. The panic attacks that used to hit me whenever I drove past any school building faded to just a tight feeling in my chest that I could breathe through. By winter, I could walk past the elementary school on my morning runs without my heart racing. Instead of the old fear and shame, I felt something steadier, like a promise to myself that if I ever saw a kid being silenced or threatened by adults who were supposed to protect them, I wouldn't look away or stay quiet. I'd remember what it felt like to be 8 years old and alone with the truth, and I'd make sure that kid knew someone believed them. Well, that was definitely a journey to share with you all. Kinda makes you look at things a little differently, right? Thanks for sticking around with me. Like the video, it helps more than you think.